North Haven, East Haven, who's on public drinking water, gets their water out of big reservoirs. So issues that we're always concerned about is making sure that those reservoirs are protected with a lot of forest land. Of course, when you have pure water in your reservoirs, it comes into streams, and it means that Long Island Sound is clean. So the whole system is very, very interconnected, and we try to work on it as an interconnected system. And one of the issues that we're facing right now in the state is a drought, of course. And, I think it's really coming home to roost how important it is to make sure we have adequate water, and also that we're not selling that water to companies that are going to bottle it and export it out of the state. I mean, we just have to look at that issue very carefully, because in drought times, in some areas of the state, we need every drop we have. So, yeah.
And we also have an affirmative enforcement side of, we have some litigators who are focused on ensuring that the statewide regulations as far as pollution are, and sewage dumping, those types of protections are being met.
So I can give you just a couple of examples of that. We reached out to the city of Danbury and let them know that they'd had a lot of sewage overflows, and issued them a notice of potentially intent to sue. And it was largely ignored by the city. Unfortunately, the talks did not go anywhere, and we know that there were scores and scores of sewage overflows coming out of their pipes because they haven't been well maintained, and that there needs to be a reinvestment in those pipes. So we have filed suit in federal court. We've also done that in Westchester with 11 towns there and the county of Westchester, because, again, the sewage pipes are in terrible shape and there's lots of sewage overflows going on. So we always try to seek solutions, but oftentimes when there's big investments that absolutely need to be made, the way in which to leverage those investments and return the rivers to health and make sure that people aren't exposed to raw sewage is through litigation. We've done the same thing with a series of junkyards in Connecticut over the last several years that we're not operating with permits, and we're not, had a lot of stormwater, rainwater mixing in with oils and grease in their junkyards and going right on the rivers. And so by bringing those suits, we got, permits in place, and now better ways of handling the water at those junkyards so it's not polluting nearby rivers. So this is just an example of the kind of work, but we also work on making sure that the laws are fair and strong, and a lot of work went in by our legal team on the storm, controlling rainwater pollution in the state of Connecticut. So, and then we also have, engineers who are actually producing the results or the solutions on the ground. Like, for instance, here in New Haven, we have helped the city design and install rain gardens that are absorbing stormwater off the street. They're pretty, they're beautiful to look at, but they're actually, acting as filters for polluted stormwater, and that helps absorb it and get it into the ground so it doesn't, overtax our sewage system. So, yeah.
Whose responsibility is it to maintain the sewage pipes? You talked about the sewage pipes.
Right. Yes, it's whoever runs the sewage system.
Okay.
So often in Connecticut, it is the town. But, for instance, here in New Haven, we have a regional water pollution control authority, so it's about 5 towns that are part of that. So that regional water pollution control authority controls the sewage pipes, and then, so that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you.
So I know that rain gardens and sewage and all that is a part of reducing nitrogen that flows into the sound. Can you talk a little bit about the nitrogen plans that I know were announced, and are they in jeopardy at all moving forward?
Okay, so again, our legal team worked with my staff, and we issued a petition to EPA back in February 2015, saying that Long Island Sound was really sick still, even though we've made some first strides. Our bays and harbors are often in trouble with too much floating algae that makes a big mess, too much nitrogen that's actually destroying our marshes, in cases not enough oxygen so that there are fish kills, all kinds of issues that people care about for the sound. And as a result, or I should say, about 6 months or 8 months later, EPA came out with a pretty comprehensive nitrogen plan, which is just getting started. So the good news about some of this is that the states always have had a big role in enforcing clean water issues and making them happen. So the state of Connecticut has stepped out, and the state of New York and Long Island have both put together plans, but you really need the EPA there with a requirement for getting standards set for nitrogen and then enforcing those standards and providing the towns with the tools and some funding to allow those investments to move forward. That's all what EPA Region 1 and Region 2 have been dedicated to. We've got now engineers who have been hired by EPA on contract, fortunately, that are going to be, looking at what are the endpoints that we need to get to bring these bays and harbors back to health, so that water's full of oxygen and we're not losing our marshes and we don't have big vats of slimy algae. So that's all happening. Your question, Anna, is a really important one. Now what happens, right? Now what happens? We've got a new administration. We're really concerned because just yesterday, I think it was, they announced that they're going to enter into no new grants with anyone. Well, that affects Long Island Sound in a number of different ways, because several of EPA grants programs are exactly the way in which we'd start implementing projects on the ground to reduce nitrogen, to reduce sewage overflows. It can be in the form of loans that towns get. It can be in the form of stormwater grants that allow us to put rain gardens in the ground here in New Haven. There's a variety of different ways. So putting a freeze on these grants, which are really clean water grants, right? Or in some instances, clean air grants. That's a real challenge and real problem. So we got to watch this really closely. And, I don't think there's a person in the country that doesn't want clean water. So I certainly hope the new administration gets that message, and back to what Claire was saying, so important that we continue to make climate reductions a priority because of the impacts that climate change is having here in Connecticut, in Long Island Sound, in our rivers, and in our neighborhoods, and what it's likely to do in the future. And we're happy to talk about that one.
So with potential freeze, or I guess a freeze on these grants, have you thought about other avenues in which some of these things could happen? Or I know the Environmental Advisory Council in New Haven has proposed like a ban on pesticides in the city, like things like that. Are there other ways that we could address some of these issues without going for federal dollars?
Sure. I mean, there's things that every person can do, right? It's also really important to do things collectively too. So funding is not the only answer, but I will say, when you're talking about putting rain gardens on the streets in New Haven to absorb water from the streets, that's a public investment that needs to be done. Now, in backyards, people can install their own rain gardens. People can fertilize yet less, right? Put in less pesticides. They can make sure if they have a septic system that is cleaned out and pumped regularly. There's a lot of things that people can do, but I'd also say that the purpose of the Clean Water Act is a combination of providing, clear standards that everyone has to pay attention to, right? I mean, it's what we found, for instance. I'll just talk about the junkyards for a moment. There were junkyards out there that were doing a good job, right? But without standards and permits, then you have the folks who are voluntarily doing your job and other folks who aren't, and they're making money by not following environmental laws, right? And so we really need to level the playing field, and that's a big purpose of the enforcement effort. But I think your first point was really important, is that all of us have a role to play, whether it's in our backyard, right? Whether it's, seeing if you can be part of solar, which you're going to talk about in a minute, right? Community solar. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I'll stay waiting to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So, community solar is something that Connecticut Fund for the Environment has been pushing for the state. Last year, the legislature passed a shared pilot program, a shared solar pilot program, which unfortunately is very limited in scope. It's only 8 megawatts of solar generation. And while we had hoped for a full-scale program that all Connecticut residents could take advantage of immediately, we are hopeful that this will set up the systems in place to enable a full-scale shared solar. And that really, what it does is it allows ratepayers or people who live in buildings or homes that they can't have solar themselves. It allows them to essentially plug into the electric grid and benefit from those who can have shared solar and can, it's a sort of a co-op. But right now, Connecticut law does not allow for unlimited shared solar type programs. So we're really hoping that eventually our state will get there, and that this pilot will show us that path. We actually have been urging to move forward with a full-scale program prior to the termination of this pilot. The pilot has had a slow start, and actually there was a RFP, a request for proposal, submitted, and projects proposed, but we've not yet heard who will be getting these projects. So we have our eye on that. But some of our sort of immediate legislative priorities are making sure that the standards in Connecticut are strengthened and continue to be strengthened with respect to our greenhouse gas emissions. So right now, Connecticut is under certain commitments under the Global Warming Solutions Act to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we're on a very positive trend of reducing those emissions for several years, but the last 3 to 4 years have actually shown an uptick back up. And there's a debate about why that is. A lot of people attribute it to falling gas prices and people becoming less conscious about the type of cars they drive and the fuel economy of those cars. But we are really fighting to make sure that we meet the targets that are set out in 2050 and beyond. So we're hoping that this year the legislature will pass legislation setting interim targets in 2030 and 2040 to make sure that our state remains accountable for the goals that it set back in 2008. And similarly, Connecticut has what's called Renewable Portfolio Standards, which is the amount of energy that our electric distribution companies, our utilities, have to get from renewable sources. And we've had sort of an upward ticking set of targets that end actually in 2020. By 2020, our utilities are supposed to source at least 20% of the energy from renewable sources. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily have to generate it. It means that they're purchasing what are called renewable energy credits. So someone out there is producing this clean energy, and it means that we don't need as much fossil fuel-based energy. So they're required to purchase at least 20% of their energy through this renewable energy credit REC system. So we're seeking to extend those beyond to 2030, 2040 to make sure that we're still creating a certain market that incentivizes renewables as opposed to fossil fuel-based energy. And it's possible, and it's actually the the cost of solar, for example, has drastically declined. It's really competitive it's more competitive than coal certainly, and getting as competitive as natural gas, and we really want the state, rather than investing infrastructure in natural gas and pipelines, for example, to go full-scale renewables, all in on renewables, and because there is enough capacity through shared solar, if we have a full-scale shared solar program, that would incentivize both commercial and residential homeowners to put solar on their roofs, because they could then benefit from that by supplying out to the grid, and not only they're paying for their own energy that they use, but potentially getting a return. And our municipalities are really interested in it because it's such a cost saving for them.
Do you see people moving in the near future more people moving into solar energy?
Yeah, so because the price has decreased so dramatically, and also it's become, the technologies have improved. People often think, oh, it's Connecticut, we're not a southern state, we're not Florida, we don't have enough sun, but that actually isn't true. The cold weather has nothing to do with how much generation you can soak up. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratories recently did a study that showed that actually rooftop solar could supply Connecticut with potentially up to 50% of its solar and more. So there's on rooftops alone. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's rooftops, there's brownfields, which we think are a really positive way to use land that would otherwise not be used in as positive a beneficial way for the state. So we do see a lot of hope with solar.
So why do you think there's a resistance to these? Everything you're saying sounds great. Sure, it's something that you are frustrated with all the time, but why is there, still a push for a pipeline rather than solar at the state level? Are you seeing, or is it just because we're stuck in our ways, or what's going on there?
Well, actually, we're very hopeful right now. There was a proposal for a new gas pipeline. There was a request for a proposal that was going to extend through some of the northeastern states, and our Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP, rescinded that proposal recently due to some, their justification was that because the other states had backed out, Connecticut had to too. It wouldn't be economically viable for Connecticut, but we're hopeful that we can take advantage of that pause and say, we don't need to build this infrastructure that ratepayers will still be paying for 20, 30 years down the road. And we're really hoping this does represent a pivot away from gas infrastructure.
So what do we need to do to educate people about solar, about energy, to protect the environment? What do we need to do more of?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just say to all your listeners, it may seem strange, but right now with low gas prices, ironically, it's the best time to be buying particularly used either high efficiency fuel vehicles or electric vehicles. When gas prices are high, those vehicles are in demand, right? So they're in less demand right now. So it's a good time to buy a cheap used either electric vehicle or a hybrid, Prius, whatever, and get into that habit. So that's point one, right? And I think it's tough. I think many people are struggling financially and very, very busy and very stressed out right now. So I think one of the beauties of shared solar is it gives people an opportunity to easily purchase, get into purchasing solar without having to do a bunch of the work themselves, right? Without having to figure it out. But we are starting to make it easier also, and I don't know if we what the status is of our solar lease program, if you happen to have a rooftop that is available. We have certainly had programs where companies will lease the equipment to you. You end up with cheaper electricity, and you're also becoming a producer of clean energy at the same time. Now, again, not every, go ahead.
Right,
Yeah.
I think what Kurt's referring to is what's called net metering, and actually this is something we're working on at a local and municipal level. We're trying to educate condo associations and apartment buildings, commercial buildings regarding net metering, because this is one way where you can essentially have shared solar within one building. If you're on 1 meter, the landlord or condo association can do what's called submetering. And if they invest in solar panels that they can put on their roof, or some people have done fuel cells, and use that as a source of generation, and then each individual unit is metered. So instead of the old way where there was one huge bill and everyone got a flat rate for whatever heat they're using, this is an individual assessment, which actually both encourages efficiency. If you know you're only paying for what you're using, you're more mindful of that, and it also brings in the opportunity to source from renewables.
Hannah? Well, I have a question. So, some people are concerned about the drought with water.
Yep.
So, how likely is that in the near future, or way off into distant lands, or?
Yeah. So concerns about the drought, both now and in the future, and changing weather patterns and climatic changes, I think is what you're asking about.
Yes.
Yeah. So, one of the unfortunate side events of a changing climate is unpredictability and much more variability in weather patterns. And so periods of drought and periods of flood actually are likely to both increase sporadically. And one of the predictions is for there to be, and sometimes more rain coming down, but in a very short period of time, and less predictability. And we're in a period of less predictability because we've had very little rain. So that's having a lot of impact on Connecticut. Again, we're fortunate in the New Haven area, but folks who are driving down the Merritt Turnpike might notice the big pipes that are running through forest areas down there. They're actually moving water between reservoirs and redistributing water down there because they're really being impacted by the drought. So back to the drought, I would just say it is important for folks to be mindful of water use for sure. I think we certainly have been big supporters of both utilities looking at the leaks in their water pipes, right, and trying to use the water more efficiently, but also big supporters of low water energy appliances. But back to your question about the weather and what we're likely to see, it is hard to talk right now about flood problems on rivers, but what we've seen also, even though we have drought this year, what we've seen in recent years is big downbursts of water. You may remember back in Sandy up in Vermont, there were these enormous floods, right? Enormous floods up there. We've had them down here in Connecticut as well. So that's just an issue for a long-term planning. It's also an issue for how we control our runoff from rainstorms, right? And again, it's another reason for having rain gardens and making our pavement more pervious so the water can go through it and get back down to the ground, is that all that water rushing off of pavements or off of roofs runs into those rivers real quickly and forms flood problems. So putting in green infrastructure does a variety of things from a pollution point of view during a regular rainstorm, but it can also help with flood issues as well. So it comes back to, how do we how do we prevent this? We also know that, sea level is rising, right? We also know that wind conditions are changing out on Long Island Sound due to weather pattern changes that are creating problems in the Sound. There's all kinds of issues that we're fighting against. So I think it comes back to the fact that we have to do both of all these things at once, right? We need to be thinking about how to be more drought resistant, right? How to use water more efficiently, how to use energy more efficiently, and how to create renewables so that we are lowering the damage from from too much fossil fuels, right? Which is probably the biggest environmental issue certainly facing the globe, but facing the world, and will continue to be. So those are major issues.
I don't know if you had other things to talk about, but maybe if, we can also chat about the report card that came out last year.
Sure.
Showed some really positive things for this area, but as was talked about a lot, like there's still stuff we can do. And is there, I don't know, to avoid going down like doom and gloom, oh my God, we're never going to be able to save the environment, is there ways to, look at that report card and be positive and
Sure.
think about, all that?
Sure. I think one of the things that is a poster child for positiveness on Long Island Sound is the fact that last 2 years we had these magnificent humpback whales coming back into the Sound for the first time in probably several hundred years, right? We butchered them to death for a bunch of time, right? Now they're starting to recover slowly. But they came back because they had fish to feed on. They came to the table because it was lunchtime, and there was lunch set in the table at Long Island Sound. And that's a positive conservation story, because groups, like ourselves, and we led the fight in Long Island Sound, but groups up and down the coast worked to put a cap on these little silverfish called bunkerfish or menhaden. And we're starting to see them in numbers that I haven't seen before in my lifetime, and it's bringing these whales in, and it's also bringing back striped bass, and it's also bringing back bluefish, and everything that feeds on them, which is basically almost everything in Long Island Sound. So you set the table down at the bottom of the food web, right, and these big creatures up on top are really happy because they're sitting there fat and happy, right? So that's something that we've seen happen just in the last 4 years. That cap was put in effect 4 years ago, and already we're seeing the change. So oftentimes, if you do work with nature, like we're doing, opening up rivers, we opened up the West River this year, took down a dam there, we took down 2 dams on the Quinnipiac River. We reopened a stream down in Old Lyme and saw literally 150,000 more fish come up that year, after we did that. So you can see these impacts. We also know that Long Island Sound is better than it was 30 years ago, right? It has started to recover. The issue that I want to get back to, and talk about Claire's work, is that the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, is that we're starting to see indications of the impact of climate change that are negative, in negative cycle with these pollution issues that we're talking about, too much nitrogen, right? When Claire is getting more solar panels on homes, that means the sea level is rising less, which means there's less stress on our marshes every day, right? It means that we're having less of those big rainstorms, so our neighborhoods are getting flooded less. So we have to do the preventive side, but we've also got to rebuild the muscle of our natural systems. And often these natural systems will protect people from floods. We're working on a project right now that isn't completely funded, but we've developed some initial plans down in East Shore Park in New Haven. There's about a half a mile of shoreline there that people don't use right now. It's kind of, you come to it, there's a big eroded bank, it goes down like 6 feet, it's a drop off, it's dangerous for kids. So the parks people really don't want people there. But what we hope to do is to invest in the power of nature, in setting up some tidal marshes, reducing the steepness of that bank, reducing stormwater so it's not eroding, getting that stormwater back into the ground. And at the end, New Haveners will have another half mile of beautiful shoreline with beach and marsh to be able to go and hang out, right? And Lord knows we don't have enough places to hang out and enjoy Long Island Sound. So these are the kinds of systems, it's for people, right? But it's also for the wildlife that will enjoy it, and it's also going to be a filter and a sponge to protect the people in that neighborhood. So we have to be thinking about this, how do you do multiple tasks at once? Things for people, things for wildlife, things to protect our neighborhoods. And we've got to do it. But, to your point, we're seeing the Sound continuing on an arc of healing, right? We've got these issues with climate that are so extreme that we've got to do everything we can to get renewables happening, everything we can to use our energy more efficiently, And I'll tell just a little tiny personal story that isn't that different. I went from private practice to being a public interest attorney in leader. So I now finally, like 2 years ago, made as much money as I used to in private practice 25 years ago, right? But even on my relatively paltry income, I was able to rebuild a house with my wife, But the fun part of it was we've got it energy efficient enough so that the solar panels are producing all electricity, and also I was renting a little electric smart car, which was incredibly cheap, like $140 a month. And I used that for 3 years. For the cost of operating that, I paid $2.75 to go 18,000 miles, okay? And all the electricity was powered by these, effectively, by net metering situation where but I'm saying we can do this, right? It's affordable to a guy like me, right? I'm not Mr. Trump, right? I'm just like a working staff. And you got to make it a priority. I mean, people do have to make it a priority. They have to love. Yeah. I mean, the best thing to do, I think, is to wake up in the morning, look out at this beautiful place, and say how lucky are we, and what can we do to protect it, right?
I think Kurt's point is important in that we really need to get the message out that taking advantage of solar and electric vehicles, while there are upfront costs, there are long-term savings, and we luckily have in Connecticut the Connecticut Green Bank, which does phenomenal work with investing and building, leveraging off investments to create new opportunities, and they have a lot of different loan opportunities, which does make it financially viable for people of many income levels to say, okay, if I want to do what Kurt did and become self-sufficient, and instead of going to the gas pump every week and spending $50 filling up my gas pump, I'm going to let the solar panels on my roof charge my car every night. That's where we need to go, and that's where we can go. We just have to make it seem like it's accessible to everyone, and it should be, and it can be, and hopefully it will be. And we do have, for the positive story on the climate side, while we're facing a huge challenge with our federal leadership, we do have a state government that has been a leader and has been committed to addressing climate change. We have the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which is working really hard right now to come up with a long-term vision for Connecticut. The Connecticut Fund for the Environment has a seat at that table, and we've been pushing for very aggressive policies and hope that Connecticut will continue to be a leader.
I think the other thing that's good is that we've heard our Governor Malloy step up around climate. Governor Cuomo, the governor of California, have all said that the states now have to band together. If the feds aren't going to do this, the states have to band together. And I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by that. And I do think that, I was at the march in New York over the weekend, and the number of signs about protecting the planet was very inspiring to me. I mean, people really have to take it to the streets right now and let their leaders know, their local leaders, whether it's their mayor or the governor or, and support our congressional delegation and just, stand in solidarity, around this, because it may not, I'm not realizing, I won't see the worst impacts of climate change in my lifetime. I'm lucky. You can tell by the color of my hair, I'm no longer 20 years old, but, I worry about my kids, you worry about your grandkids, you have really little ones, I got 20 years old, like what happens to those guys, right? And we simply have to be a moral force and, and show them the way and have them push us, right? Have them push us from down below, make this happen.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So how much time are you getting to spend on Long Island Sound stuff?